There are some moments in life that stay with you long after they happen. Moments that make you question what you really know about the people standing right next to you every single day. Tonight, we have a collection of those kinds of stories. True accounts from real people who came face to face with something they never expected, something that shook them right down to their core. These are not fictional tales invented to give you a chill. These are real experiences, uncomfortable, unsettling, and impossible to forget. So settle in, get comfortable, and stay with me, because once these stories begin, you won't want to stop listening. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome to the channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single story. We're so glad you're here, and trust me, you are going to want to stay. Our first story tonight comes from a man who spent 4 years working as a mall security guard. On the surface, that might not sound like the kind of job that leads to a life-changing experience. Quiet corridors, flickering screens, and the occasional shoplifter. That's what most people picture. But what this man discovered during those 4 years was something far stranger, far darker, and far more unsettling than anything a textbook on security work could ever prepare you for. He had fallen into mall security work back around 2009, during a time when the entire job market had essentially collapsed in on itself. It wasn't exactly his dream career, but the pay was reasonable enough. The night shifts didn't bother him, and some of the store clerks were generous enough to occasionally let the security staff in on their 20% employee discount, which made things considerably more bearable. His coworkers were a good group of people, easygoing, unpretentious, the kind of guys who showed up, did their jobs, and went home without drama or complications. Even the boss was laid back. Nobody was looking for trouble. It was, in a word, normal, and for a while that was just fine. But then Craig arrived, and from the very first day, something about him felt different. Craig was a short man, soft-spoken, slightly balding, with a pair of glasses perched on his nose in a quiet manner that made him easy to overlook at first glance. He was either at the very tail end of his 30s or just stepping into his 40s, and word around the workplace was that he had been working as a security guard ever since he dropped out of high school. That meant he had been doing this job for a very long time. And yet, looking at him, you never would have guessed it. He didn't carry himself like a man with experience. He was shy, gentle, and seemed like the kind of person who might quietly step aside if a confrontation ever presented itself rather than step forward to handle it. He didn't look like someone who could hold his own if things turned physical. But his references told a completely different story. His boss had received nothing but glowing reports from everyone who had previously employed him, and perhaps most impressively, Craig had not taken a single sick day in nearly 6 straight years. Not one. And as anyone who has managed people long enough knows, that kind of unwavering reliability is not something you can teach. You either have it or you don't. So Craig got the job, and before long, he and our narrator were working shifts together. Now, a lot of mall security work, particularly during the day, is essentially a waiting game. The mall was equipped with around 20 or so cameras, including those monitoring the parking lot. And a large portion of every shift was spent sitting in front of a massive wall of screens, scanning for shoplifters, watching for suspicious behavior, and keeping tabs on every corner of the building. During the daytime hours, they were the eyes that watched everything but rarely had to act. The real action, if you could call it that, came during the night shifts, but we'll get to that. One afternoon, the two of them were sitting in front of the screen bank together, each monitoring their individual feeds, when our narrator noticed something curious. Craig was completely fixed on one particular camera, not glancing around, not switching between feeds, just locked on one single store with an intensity that caught his attention. And when he leaned in to see which store Craig was watching so closely, he saw that it was the children's clothing and toy shop, the one that sold everything for babies and children under the age of 5. Now, it was a sad but well-known fact among the security staff that this particular store had become one of the biggest shoplifting targets in the entire mall. Certain individuals had apparently figured out that infant clothing and baby items moved quickly in the local underground market, which had turned the store into a persistent problem. So naturally, the first thought was that Craig had spotted something suspicious. Maybe a shoplifter lingering near the merchandise, maybe someone acting strangely near the displays. But when he asked Craig about it, Craig quickly switched to another camera feed and said something vague along the lines of, "Oh, never mind, it was nothing." He didn't think too much about it at the time. That sort of thing happened to everyone. You thought you spotted something, you looked closer. It turned out to be nothing. Easy enough to dismiss. But then, about an hour before the end of that same shift, he caught Craig doing it again. And this time, when he called him on it, saying something like, Watching the baby store again, huh? Craig flat out denied it and clicked over to a different feed without missing a beat. Now, somewhere in the back of his mind, a small theory started forming. The young woman who worked at that particular store was, by any reasonable measure, quite attractive. And so he landed on what seemed like the most obvious, most harmless explanation. Craig had a crush on her. He teased him about it gently, watched Craig turn red as a traffic light at a busy intersection, and figured that was the end of the mystery. Craig told him to knock it off with a barely suppressed grin, and he backed off, but not before adding something like, "Turns out you're human after all. You're all right, kid." And when he clocked out that evening, he gave Craig one last playful warning. "Don't let anyone else catch you staring at the baby store girl, or they're going to think you're stalking her." Over the following month, he found himself working a stretch of night shifts, and 2 of those shifts were spent alongside Craig. By this point, the creepy robot impression had faded completely. Craig was just Craig, a quiet, focused guy who kept his head down and did his job well. He was still giving him a hard time about working up the courage to ask the girl out, telling him that the worst she could do was say no. Craig just grinned and told him to mind his own business. Night shifts operated differently from day shifts. Once every half hour, one guard would leave the monitoring station and walk a full circuit of the mall complex, while the others stayed behind at the screen bank to watch their partner's back. It was a sensible system. The walker had eyes on the ground, the others had eyes in the sky. But it wasn't a perfect system, and it had one significant weakness. If the person watching the screens wasn't paying close attention, things could slip by unnoticed. And on one particular night, during Craig's 2:30 in the morning patrol, that's exactly what happened. Our narrator wasn't watching the screens with full attention when he happened to glance up and notice something wrong. One of the store shutters, the kind that roll down to seal the shops off after closing, had been partially lifted, not all the way, but enough that someone could duck underneath it. He immediately radioed Craig to let him know, but Craig didn't respond. And then, in a flash of cold realization, 2 thoughts hit him at the exact same moment. Craig wasn't answering his radio, and the store with the open shutter was the baby clothes shop. He grabbed his keys and headed straight there. A few minutes later, he was ducking under the half-raised shutter, calling out into the darkened store. Craig responded immediately, stepping out from behind one of the display racks and nearly startling him out of his skin. When asked what in the world he was doing in there, Craig said he thought he'd heard something coming from inside the store, but that excuse fell apart almost instantly because that's exactly what the radio was for. If Craig had heard something suspicious, the correct response was to call it in so that his partner at the screens could see what was happening in real time. He didn't need to duck inside himself. He knew the job. He was good at the job. So why was he acting like a rookie who didn't know the most basic protocol? He told Craig firmly that what he'd done could get him fired and left it at that. He didn't push it further, not that night. But the very next shift, Craig thanked him. He thanked him for caring enough to come find him, for not reporting what he'd seen to the boss, and, most strangely, for physically getting him out of that store. And it was that last thank you that lingered in the air in the strangest way, almost like the gratitude of someone who had been pulled back from a ledge they shouldn't have been standing on. It should have set off louder alarm bells than it did. But at the time, all he really wanted was an explanation. So he pushed, gently, and Craig dropped his gaze and said something like, I'm going to be a father, and I'm scared. He started to offer congratulations, but something about the whole thing felt off. He'd heard men talk about impending fatherhood before, nervous, excited, complaining, celebrating. But in all his experience, he had never once known a man with a pregnant partner to keep it completely secret until the moment he was cornered about something else entirely. The timing was too convenient, the delivery was too rehearsed. He didn't call Craig out on it directly, but he knew deep in his gut that Craig was hiding something. He just didn't know what. And then one evening, everything changed. He was at home when a message came through on a group chat with some friends. His buddy Chris had sent a video, followed by a string of reactions ranging from shocked laughter to disbelief. Chris was the type to share all kinds of things. Funny clips, strange internet oddities, things that made you laugh, things that made your skin crawl. He opened the video not knowing what to expect. What appeared on the screen was what looked like a child's bedroom, toys on shelves, soft pastel walls. And then without warning, a grown man walked into the frame. He was dressed as a baby, a full bonnet on his head, makeup on his face, and an oversized pacifier in his mouth. He performed for the camera for a moment, babbling, pretending to cry, acting out the behaviors of a very young child. And then he removed the pacifier to speak, and the face became unmistakable. It was Craig. He stood in his kitchen for a long moment after closing the video, not quite knowing what to do with himself. His first instinct was to reach for an explanation that made sense, and one of the thoughts that floated to the surface was that this was why Craig had been drawn to the baby store. He obviously wasn't there to steal anything or to harm anyone, but the knowledge of why he was interested in that store made something uncomfortable stir in his chest. And then came the darker thoughts, the ones he didn't want to have but couldn't stop. Was Craig dangerous? Was this something that could escalate? Was the man he'd been working alongside, the quiet, reliable, seemingly harmless Craig, actually someone who posed a real threat? He called Chris to find out where the video had come from and how widely it had been shared. The answer wasn't reassuring. It had already been sent to practically everyone Chris knew, which meant it was only a matter of time before Craig was recognized by the wider community. And once that happened, he wasn't just going to face embarrassment. People were going to assume the worst. And while some would laugh, others would take it as something sinister and want to act on that. He spent the next several hours at work trying to gather the nerve to bring it up. It was one of the most awkward things he had ever had to do in his professional life, and it took the better part of 3 hours before he finally turned to Craig and said, "Hey, I saw a video today." Craig went red in an instant, and the narrator paused, just watching, letting the silence do some of the work. Craig didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen bank, visibly sweating, his whole body rigid with the effort of not reacting. The silence was its own kind of confession, and so he asked the question that mattered most, the only question that really counted in that moment. "Craig, are you dangerous? Are you someone who has unhealthy feelings toward children?" Craig's head snapped around so fast it was startling, and the response that came out of him, firm, horrified, and carrying just a hint of genuine outrage, was, "No, it's not like that. I swear to God it's not." Now he says he can never be 100% certain. Nobody can. But in that moment, the reaction felt real. It didn't feel like the desperate plea of someone trying to talk their way out of something. It had the ring of a man genuinely offended by the suggestion, and so he chose to believe it. But believing it didn't make the rest of the situation any less serious, because the video was circulating, and once people in town connected it to the security guard at the local mall, the fallout was going to be severe. So he told Craig plainly, it was time to leave. Start fresh somewhere else, somewhere nobody knew him. Get help, get perspective, and figure out whatever needed figuring out, before the internet did it for him in a much more painful way. Craig listened in silence, and then, after a long pause, he started to cry. Not a quiet cry, a real, unrestrained, several minutes long cry that filled the empty monitoring room. He didn't feel overwhelming sympathy. Posting something like that online was a deeply unwise choice, and the consequences were always going to catch up eventually. But he did feel something, because Craig's mistake had cost him everything, and no matter how strange that mistake was, there was something undeniably human about watching a person's life collapse in real time. When they clocked out that morning, Craig thanked him for the warning and said he probably wouldn't be seeing him around much anymore. He told him it was for the best, that he needed a new start, a new place, and a lot of self-reflection. That was the last time he ever saw Craig. Within a week, everyone at the mall knew. The video had made its rounds, the connections had been made, and Craig's reputation was effectively destroyed before he was even confirmed gone. The boss said it was just as well Craig had disappeared, because he'd have been let go immediately if he'd tried to come back. The general mood among the staff ranged from disgust to cold contempt. But for our narrator, what lingered wasn't contempt. It was something quieter and more troubling, a low, persistent unease. He hopes Craig found stability somewhere, found help, found peace, found something that pulled him away from the edge of something worse. Because the alternative, the thought that Craig didn't get himself sorted out, that things got darker instead of lighter, is something he doesn't let himself dwell on for too long. And he says, as a father of 2 daughters himself, that's all he's really willing to say about that. Has a coworker ever made you deeply uneasy? Someone you couldn't quite put your finger on, but something just felt wrong? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and share your experience with us. And if this story made you feel something, give it a like. You'd be surprised how much that means to us here. Our next story takes us across the Atlantic, into the world of medical science, where the stakes are high, the protocols are strict, and the unexpected still finds a way to walk right through the door. This story comes from someone who has spent the better part of 2 decades working in the medical field, first as a laboratory technician, and later in coordination and investigation roles. For a number of those years, she worked at a small medical clinic in the Greater London area. It was a modest operation. No sweeping wards or emergency departments, just the steady, careful rhythm of blood and urine testing, week in and week out. They had an X-ray room, and a few additional facilities, but for the most part, 95% of every working day revolved around sample management. And because of that, precision and care were not optional. They were everything. The idea of mishandling a biological sample was practically unthinkable, not just because of the professional implications, but because these samples belonged to real people, real patients who were counting on accurate results. Nobody at that clinic had ever received a call saying their blood sample had been misplaced. That was a matter of professional pride. So when one of their nurses came to report that he had dropped a sample, the immediate response from the team wasn't frustration about the lost sample. It was concern for the nurse himself. She's not going to use his real name, so for the purposes of this story, we'll call him Dave. When Dave dropped the sample and explained that it had slipped from his fingers after a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him, the natural response was to send him home and let him rest, which they did. 2 full days off, no questions asked. He came back looking fine, said he was feeling much better, and everyone moved on. Dave was a genuinely skilled nurse. He was a real asset to the clinic, someone they valued and wanted to take care of in return. So when it happened again several weeks later, another dizzy spell, another dropped sample, the recommendation was to book him in for a full medical checkup. Dizzy spells can be early indicators of serious underlying health conditions, and they weren't going to take any chances with his well-being. He agreed, went for the examination, and came back with a clean bill of health. No underlying issues found. A small wave of relief moved through the team. Dave even admitted that on the day of the second incident, he had skipped breakfast entirely, which, as any medical professional can confirm, can be more than enough to trigger dizziness in some people, especially during a long and physically demanding shift. So the second incident faded quietly into the background, and Dave continued working at the clinic, business as usual, until the day she walked in on him. Because Dave was trusted and because the nature of the work required periods of undisturbed focus, it was entirely normal for him to be left alone in the containment lab for extended stretches of time. Nobody thought twice about it. There was no reason to. And so when she walked in unannounced that day, not with any suspicion, not with any particular purpose, she caught him completely off guard. He was lowering a sample beaker away from his mouth, not moving it across the counter, not carrying it to a storage unit, lowering it from his mouth. She froze. He froze. Time seemed to hold its breath for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. And then the beaker slipped from his hands and hit the floor. And as it shattered, Dave looked at her and said quietly, "I dropped it," but it was far, far too late for that. She had seen everything, every detail of it, and there was absolutely nothing in the world that could unsee what she had just witnessed. Dave pleaded with her. He begged her not to tell anyone. He swore it would never happen again. He even went so far as to offer her money to stay quiet about what she had seen. But what he was asking was simply impossible. What he had done went far beyond simple misconduct. It was a serious breach of every safety protocol the clinic operated under, and a violation of trust so profound that there was genuinely no coming back from it. The answer had to be no. There was no version of events in which the answer could be anything else. It was, as she puts it with remarkable restraint, a very big deal. The General Medical Council got involved, but their primary interest seemed to be in preventing the story from reaching the newspapers. So when Dave quietly disappeared from the clinic, it suited everyone involved. The management, the council, and the clinic's reputation. From the outside, it simply looked like a departure. A member of staff had moved on. Nothing to see here. But the matter couldn't end there entirely. Procedure required that what had been witnessed be formally reported to the police. Dave had broken laws relating to the mishandling of biological materials, a category that covers everything from blood to urine to stool samples. It was unlikely to result in prison time for a first offense. A fine and a suspended sentence was the most probable outcome, they were told. But his career in the healthcare sector was finished, completely and permanently. The life he had built, the professional identity he had spent years constructing, all of it gone. And while she acknowledges the severity of what that means for a person, she also notes, with a dry but entirely understandable edge, that he probably should have considered those consequences before making the choices he made. Life at the clinic moved on without Dave. They missed his skills and his experience, genuinely. But they did not miss the feeling of knowing that someone with such deeply troubling behavior had been working alongside them, handling the samples of unsuspecting patients, day after day. It was roughly 6 or 7 weeks later, long enough that the whole incident had started to feel like something that belonged to the past, something she had almost managed to stop thinking about, when everything changed again. She had just pulled into her own driveway after driving home from work when she noticed a car pulling in directly behind her, blocking her in. She recognized it immediately. She had seen that car in the clinic's car park nearly every single day for close to 3 years. It was Dave's car. He had followed her home. She got out of her vehicle and immediately started shouting at him to get away from her house, threatening to call the police. The commotion was loud enough that her husband came outside, and her children stood watching from the front window as her husband walked directly toward Dave and made it very clear, in language that was neither polite nor subtle, that he needed to leave immediately and not come back. Dave backed away, but only once her husband made certain promises about what would happen to him if he didn't. They reported it to the police, but the situation was frustratingly limited. Dave was out on bail at that point, and unless the police caught him in the act of making a direct, credible threat, there wasn't much they could legally do beyond issuing a formal warning, stay away from her, or the behavior would be classified as harassment. But he didn't stay away. And things got worse. The situation reached its most frightening point one evening when she was driving home from work and realized, looking into her rearview mirror, that the car behind her was Dave's. She knew from that moment that she was in trouble. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was how far he was willing to take it. She had assumed he wanted to frighten her, to intimidate her, to make her feel unsafe in her own everyday life. What she hadn't considered was that he would actually try to use his car as a weapon. His driving that evening was reckless, erratic, and deliberately threatening, and it ended with her car going off the road and into a ditch. She wasn't seriously hurt, thankfully, though she did go to the hospital as a precaution. It was a deeply traumatic experience, one that left her shaken in a way that lingered long after the physical checkup was done. But this time, the evidence was undeniable. Several cameras had captured Dave's driving that night, and the footage was clear enough that police acted quickly. He was arrested, held on remand pending trial, deemed a genuine threat to public safety, and the dangerous driving charge elevated the entire case to a new level of seriousness. When all was said and done, Dave received a 3-month sentence for the accumulated offenses. She was initially appalled by how light that seemed, but in time, she came to appreciate the logic behind it. 3 months in prison for a first-time offender was not nothing, and the remaining 3 months of the suspended portion meant that any further threatening behavior would send him straight back. The deterrent effect turned out to be real. He did his time, came out, and did not return. Not to her house, not to the clinic, not to her life. Her husband, she notes, is very grateful that Dave made that choice. And now we move from the familiar world of workplaces and colleagues into something altogether stranger. A story that begins with comedy and ends somewhere that nobody could have predicted. This one comes from a comedy writer who, by the time of the telling, has managed to carve out a comfortable career for himself, including a screen credit on a show that aired on Hulu. But in the early days, things were considerably rougher. The transition from working as a comedy performer to being paid purely for his writing was a grind. His first paid writing job, as he tells it, was about as uninspiring as it gets. He was writing short comedic skits for a small company whose business model was built around creating videos that could go viral and then converting that traffic into advertising revenue. The concept wasn't entirely without merit, but the execution was stifled at every turn by an advertising contact who was so terrified of offending anyone that the life was squeezed out of every piece before it even had a chance. He's not entirely sure how the boss kept the operation profitable, but it limped along for about a year before everyone called it a day. In terms of creative satisfaction, it ranked among the lowest points of his professional life. And yet, ironically, unexpectedly, it was in that dull, forgettable job that he encountered one of the most bizarre and disturbing experiences of his entire life. And that experience centered around a man named Paul. Paul was genuinely funny, dry as a desert, sharp as a scalpel, and capable of making a single carefully placed observation land harder than an entire comedy routine from someone else. He had grown up in Quincy, Massachusetts, not far from the narrator, and the two of them got along well enough. But Paul was also deeply, genuinely strange in a way that was hard to articulate. He never joined the boss and the narrator for drinks after work. Not once, not even on his own birthday. He just wanted to go home, and whenever anyone asked him what he got up to in his apartment, the answers were always variations of nothing, brief, unrevealing, and seemingly designed to end the conversation before it really started. He didn't have a partner, no children, and beyond that, his personal life was essentially a complete blank. Neither the narrator nor the boss pressed him on it. Paul was good at his job, he was easy to work with, and whatever he did in his private time was his own business. That was the arrangement. Until the day a female voice appeared in the office. He heard it first from behind his closed door, a woman's voice, coming from somewhere nearby, specifically from the direction of the communal room down the hall. His first instinct was a quiet, private excitement on Paul's behalf. He stayed put, not wanting to interrupt anything, thinking, good for him. But then he crept closer to his office door and listened more carefully, and what he noticed made him pause. The voice sounded older than he would have expected. Not elderly, but clearly a woman of some years. Certainly not someone in Paul's typical age range. When Paul came back down the hallway, the narrator couldn't help himself. He teased him gently about having a lady visitor at the office. But Paul's reaction was immediate and flat. I don't know what you're talking about. He assumed it was a joke. He laughed it off, tried to ask again in earnest, and then looked at Paul's face and realized that no, this was not a joke. Paul was completely serious. And the only time the narrator had ever seen someone so flatly deny something so obvious was when they were hiding an affair and didn't want it talked about. He took the hint and let it go. But it nagged at him. And then it happened again. He had taken his headphones off to take a break when he heard, quite clearly through the paper-thin wall between their offices, the sound of that same woman's voice. This time, however, it wasn't a friendly conversation. It sounded like an argument. The woman was pressing Paul on something, and Paul was alternating between sounding apologetic and sounding defensive. It got heated at one point, genuinely heated, and eventually, after 10 or 15 minutes, it went quiet. He waited. He expected to hear the woman leave, footsteps in the hallway, a door closing. But there was nothing. Half an hour passed. The office was completely silent, and he hadn't heard anyone leave. He came up with an excuse to knock on Paul's door. He tried to keep his face neutral as he knocked, preparing himself to act casual when he saw Paul and his visitor together. Paul called out for him to come in. He walked into an empty office. Paul was sitting alone. He nearly lost his mind. He had heard the woman. He was absolutely certain of it. He was certain she hadn't left, and he said as much to Paul, directly, without much tact at that point. He told Paul he wasn't going to report anything to the boss, that there was nothing wrong with having someone visit the office, that he just wanted the truth. But Paul denied everything, calmly, firmly, repeatedly. They went back and forth until something in Paul finally snapped. In the 7 or so months they had worked together, the narrator had never seen him raise his voice. But Paul shot up from his chair, face flushed deep red, and shouted at him to get out of his office. He left. They didn't speak for the rest of the day. When things finally thawed, he apologized for pushing. Paul didn't accept the apology, just looked at him with a cool irritation, as if even the mention of the whole thing was an offense. The narrator let it go and went home. Over drinks with the boss that evening, they tried to make sense of it. The best theory they could arrive at was that Paul's mystery woman was significantly older than him and he was embarrassed. Maybe she'd hidden somewhere in his office when the narrator knocked, and slipped out quietly after he left. It was awkward and strange, but it felt like the most logical explanation. They were, as it turned out, not even remotely close to the truth, and no matter how many guesses they were given, neither of them would ever have landed on what was actually happening. The next morning, everything came apart. The narrator's usual route to the office took him across a bridge, but that morning the bridge was closed. He turned around, took a longer way in, and arrived about 15 minutes late. When he got there, Paul hadn't shown up yet either. The boss chalked it up to the same traffic disruption, figured Paul had gotten stuck at the bridge and would be in within the hour, but he wasn't. And then the boss knocked on the narrator's door with an update. The bridge had been shut down because something had happened there that morning. A man had stopped his car right in the middle of the bridge, gotten out, and started screaming at the cars behind him. Police had been called and had taken the man away, most likely to a psychiatric facility, given the nature of what he was doing. Once the man and his car had been cleared, traffic was moving again. Paul could be on his way at any moment, except Paul never showed up that day, or the next. His phone went unanswered, cell and landline alike, and with the knowledge that someone had just been removed from a bridge in an apparent mental health crisis, a terrible suspicion started to form. Most people reading or listening to this story have probably already put it together. Yes, it was Paul on the bridge. Paul had stopped his car, gotten out, and started screaming at the drivers behind him. But he wasn't yelling insults at them. He was begging them to call the police. And when the police arrived, Paul told them something that sent officers running to his apartment. He said he had just murdered his mother and eaten her. Now, before the full horror of that settles in, here is the truth. He had not hurt anyone. His mother had actually been dead for several years by that point. Paul had not murdered her. But what the police found when they arrived at his apartment was, in its own way, deeply disturbing. There was a head. It had been roasted in the oven. But it was a pig's head, purchased somewhere, cooked and only partially eaten, and left in a state intact enough that officers could tell, with the naked eye, that it was not human. The police went back to Paul and told him and his doctors that what he thought had happened simply hadn't. Paul called the doctor a liar and lunged across the table at him. He was made a ward of the state that day and committed to a psychiatric hospital indefinitely, pending significant demonstrated improvement. As the narrator notes, having had a family member go through the involuntary psychiatric care system, getting out of that system is extraordinarily difficult. In many ways, it is harder than getting out of prison. The woman's voice, the arguments that seemed to come from nowhere, the denial, the complete blankness of his private life. Looking back on all of it, it takes on a different, deeply unsettling shape. The picture of a man who had been quietly unraveling for a long time in ways that nobody around him had the context to recognize. Paul, if you're out there, if by some miracle you ever come across this story, he wants you to know he misses you. He hopes you're doing better. He genuinely does. If you've ever found yourself looking back on something small and ordinary and realizing in hindsight that it meant something much more serious, let us know in the comments. You are not alone in that. And if this story moved you or surprised you, please share this video with someone who would appreciate it. It truly helps this channel more than you know. And now, our final story of the evening. This one comes from a man named Les, writing in from the northeast of the United Kingdom. He says his daughter and son-in-law are devoted listeners to the podcast, that they often play it in the car together, and that it reminds him of an old BBC radio program called Fear on 4, which he used to listen to as a young boy. A program full of ghost stories and eerie tales that he never quite forgot. He was delighted to learn that this channel features true stories submitted by real listeners, and so he wanted to share one of his own, a story from his years as a hotel concierge that has never left him, and which he suspects never will. It was the late 90s. Summer was approaching, and the hotel where Les worked was heading into the busy season already short-staffed in ways that were beginning to feel genuinely precarious. Their receptionist, a phenomenal woman who was the backbone of the entire front-of-house operation, had gone on maternity leave. They were delighted for her personally, of course, but professionally, her absence was a significant blow. And then, on top of that, they lost two of their most experienced service team members in quick succession, one of them departing with very little notice due to an undiagnosed heart condition. For a large hotel chain, this kind of personnel disruption would have been manageable. But this was a small boutique hotel, employing roughly a dozen forward-facing staff members at most. Every absence was felt immediately and deeply. They needed new people, and they needed them quickly. Management made several decisions, and one of those decisions was to hire a young man named Brian. Les knew from the moment he met Brian that something was wrong. He can't explain it more precisely than that. Call it intuition, call it decades of experience reading people in the hospitality industry, call it whatever you like. There was simply something off about the young man that he couldn't shake from the very first conversation. But Les was a fair person. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. First impressions, he knew, were imperfect things. He watched and waited for about a week, trying to give Brian a proper chance. And then he saw the way Brian looked at people. Now, it is not unheard of for a young man working in a hotel to notice an attractive guest. Rich men often travel with beautiful partners, and a baggage handler's eyes wandering briefly isn't something that requires immediate intervention. It's human nature, and as long as it stayed subtle and went no further, Les wasn't going to make an issue of it. But Brian's gaze didn't work that way. The look that Les saw on Brian's face one afternoon, directed toward a hotel guest's 11-year-old daughter, was one that made every instinct in his body stand at attention. It was not the look of someone admiring beauty. It was not innocent. It was something darker, something predatory, and it was a look that Les had absolutely no intention of allowing to go unaddressed. He went straight to management. Brian was still within his probationary period, which meant they had more flexibility to let him go. He laid out what he had seen as clearly as he could, but management's response was cautious in a way that frustrated him deeply. Technically, they could terminate him at any point during probation, but they still wanted something concrete on paper, something that would hold up if Brian chose to pursue a discrimination claim. They told Les to keep watching, and that if any guest or staff member made a formal complaint, they'd act immediately. So Les kept watching, and he kept trying to find a documented reason before anything happened. But in the end, the incident that brought everything to a head was not something Les found. It was something that happened to Brian, and it happened because a father was watching too. On a mid-October evening, as the nights were drawing in and the darkness came early, Brian finished his shift and went to the staff room to change his shoes. He always kept his dress shoes at the hotel, commuting in his trainers because, as Lay notes with the kind of dry observational humor that comes from long experience, his work shoes smelled absolutely dreadful. The routine was always the same. Brian disappeared into the staff room for a few minutes, then reappeared in the lobby and walked out through the front doors. That evening he didn't reappear. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The feeling in Les's stomach, the one he had never quite been able to dismiss since the day Brian arrived, began to grow heavier and more insistent. He told the night receptionist he was going to check on Brian, but before he could take more than a step or two toward the hallway, Brian appeared from the opposite direction, staggering. His nose, what had formerly been his nose, looked like it had been driven sideways across his face. Blood was streaming down the front of his uniform. His eyes were wide and wild with fear, the white showing all the way around. He could barely stand, and he was saying over and over, "Help me, please help me, Les." Les got him into the back office, pressed paper towels against the wound, and told the night receptionist, who was visibly pale and shaking, to call emergency services, police and ambulance. While waiting, he tried to get coherent information from Brian. Were there other people in the building? Was anyone else in danger? Were the guests safe? But Brian wasn't capable of giving clear answers. The only thing he kept repeating, between groans and the blood-soaked towels pressed to his face, was, "Don't let him get me. Please don't let him kill me." Who? Where? What had happened? Brian wouldn't or couldn't say. The lobby felt enormous and exposed in those minutes. Every shadow a potential threat, every sound from the hallway a reason to tense. Les walked back out to make sure the night receptionist wasn't alone, standing there in that strange and frightening quiet. And then a man appeared. He was barefoot, wearing shorts and a t-shirt despite the October chill, and he walked into the lobby with a single controlled question. Where is he? Les assessed the situation in a split second. This was the man who had broken Brian's nose. That much was obvious. And for just a brief, fleeting moment, almost too fast to name, a thought passed through his mind. He knew Brian was a creep. He had believed that from the very beginning. And it wasn't impossible that Brian had stumbled into something terrible that had absolutely nothing to do with his own behavior. Violent people don't always need a reason, but they do usually have one. It took a few minutes of careful conversation, of gradually talking the man down from a state of barely contained fury, before the full picture emerged. The hotel operated with 12 rooms total, built around a philosophy of low occupancy and exceptional quality. 4 single rooms, 5 doubles, and then 3 larger suites, rooms 10, 11, and 12, referred to internally as the family rooms. Each family suite consisted of a generous adult's room with television, lounge area, and small dining space, connected to a separate, smaller bedroom specifically designed for children. For fire safety reasons, both rooms could be accessed independently from the first-floor corridor, meaning the children's room, 11 Billions, had its own door that opened from the hallway. That evening, just before getting into bed, the father had decided to look in on his 2 daughters. Both primary school age, both fast asleep in room 11B. And standing in the near-complete darkness of that children's room, watching his daughters as they slept, was Brian. He had no good reason to be there. He had no professional justification. He was simply standing in the dark, watching. And the moment the father understood that, the moment he confirmed that Brian had no business being in that room, everything that happened next was perhaps the most understandable reaction a parent could have. He went after him. And by the time Brian staggered into the hotel lobby, his face told the complete story of what that encounter had looked like. What followed was, as Les puts it, a complete shambles. After talking the father down from a state of intent to cause significantly more damage, the police were called and the corridor security footage was reviewed. And in one of those deeply ironic twists that the law sometimes produces, the footage showed the father's assault clearly enough that he was the one placed in handcuffs. Brian had done more than enough to warrant immediate dismissal. But standing in a hotel room, watching sleeping children, as horrifying as it is in context, did not constitute a criminal act on its own. The law saw one person who had inflicted serious bodily harm and one person who had, technically, done nothing but stand in a room. The father was arrested on suspicion of assault. Brian was treated as the victim. Les makes clear that he has no idea what ultimately happened to the father, but he hopes sincerely that the man did not end up serving any time for what he did. Any parent in that situation, he says, would have done exactly the same. Brian, on the other hand, Les knows exactly what happened to him. The clinic saw to it themselves. He was dismissed with immediate effect, and it was, in Les's words, good riddance to bad rubbish. Thank you so very much for spending this evening with us, dear friends. Stories like these remind us how much of life happens just beneath the surface, in the quiet moments, in the people we think we know, in the choices we make when no one is watching. We hope that tonight's stories gave you something to think about, something to feel, and maybe even something to talk about with the people you love. What do you think would have happened if Craig had never been recognized in that video? What would you have done if you were in Les's position that night? Write your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and your perspective genuinely matters to this community. If you enjoyed tonight's narration, please hit the like button and share this video with a friend who loves a good story. It means the world to us, and it helps this channel reach more wonderful people just like you. New videos go up every Monday and Thursday at 9 in the evening Eastern Time, and there are live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights as well. If you have a true story of your own that you'd like to share, you can submit it directly to the email address in the description below. You might just hear your own story featured right here. For early access to future narrations and exclusive bonus content, consider joining us over on Patreon. Every bit of support keeps these stories alive and this community growing. And don't forget to check out the Let's Read podcast, available wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as the Saturn Soul True Crime channel. All links waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here, friends. Take good care of yourselves and the people you love, and we will see you in the next story.